Start my welcome. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library. Very excited to have Dr. David Kalivas here to talk about the history of civil rights and racism, and he's going to be giving us a historical perspective on that tonight. But before we get to David, I'd like to just say a couple things. One is that we do have captions enabled in this program, so they'll be scrolling across the bottom of your screen. You can enable or disable them down at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says live transcript, and I'll put some instructions in the chat about that. I'd like to thank the Middlesex Community College for partnering with us on this program. They were the ones that actually introduced me to David, so I'm really appreciative of that. And we always like to thank the Library Foundation for supporting all of our adult programs. We would not be able to do programs like this without them. And I would like to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A. We will be taking questions after David's presentation. And if you wouldn't mind using the chat for comments and for any tech issues, I'll be paying attention to that. So all that done, now we can move on to the talk with David Kalivas, who is currently a senior adjunct professor of history at the UMass Lowell. Prior to retirement, he was a full-time professor of history in Middlesex Community College for nearly 40 years. For the last 13 years of his career at the college, he served as the founding director of the Commonwealth Honors Program. His teaching and research interests cover a broad range of topics in world history with specialties in the history of racism, religion, and cross-cultural interactions. So if you were here at the very beginning, you heard David talking a little bit about some of his other interests. So I would like to hand it over to David and welcome, and thank you so much for doing this talk with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this, Mina. Without your good work, frankly, and your passion and perseverance to make these programs happen, nothing would happen. And so I really thank you for organizing and for inviting me tonight. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So I thought I would begin. First of all, hello, everyone. I, of course, can't see you. And so this is the Zoom world. I'm sure you've heard from other folks who have done presentations, and it's a little different. We don't have the energy of being in a room where we can actually see the people we're talking to and engage. But I can feel you all out there, and so that's a great thing. So thank you for coming tonight. And I have put together a presentation on race, racism, and civil rights, an historical perspective. And I thought before I go to the slides and go to the formal presentation, I would start talking a little bit about myself, just so you know who I am and how I came to this topic. I have spent pretty much most of my career reading and thinking about and teaching about the history of race and racism and issues relevant to human rights and civil rights. And I started, I mean, first of all, I started engaging this topic. I'm just going to take us back 50 years. We do have limited time. I'm hoping to keep my remarks to 50 minutes, maybe no more than 60. And then to have hopefully 20 minutes or a half hour for questions. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's important to realize that I've come to this topic and engaged in this issue for the past 50 years. And I starting as a high school student when about now 50 years ago. And wow, 1970, anyway, 50 years ago, going to high school. And when I first was learning about the Civil War, it was taught as something that was, for instance, states' rights. When I first learned about the Holocaust, it was a little paragraph in the textbook. We didn't really engage it in any significant way. But when I went to college in 1975, I took a course, and I remember seeing a film called Night and Fog, which was about the death camps in Nazi Germany. And it was in an auditorium, a big auditorium. And when I saw that film and we really began to engage the issue of the Holocaust, I was bowled over by what I hadn't learned. And it was the most horrible experience to learn for the first hand racism at work in the Holocaust. And then that engaged me to thinking more and more about the issue of race and racism and ethnocentrism And that jump-started my journey, if you would, to study the history of race and racism, and to increasingly realize, as I studied it, that race is a social construction. We are only one human race. There are no races. Yet racism is a real and deadly force in our societies globally with deadly consequences. And I have been engaged with this, and for the 50 years, well, no one am I saying 50 plus years now, right? And as I have learned more and more as I've gone along this journey, and I simply want to share what I have learned. And that's what I'll be doing tonight. So that was just a personal note. Now let me share the screen. Oh, wrong screen. Okay. Hold on. Oh, where am I? I've only done this how many times? Hold on, let me unshare the screen. Stop share. Okay, hold on. Of course, I set everything up. Let me do this. Sorry about that. Can you, there we go. There we go.
Looks good, David.
Yep, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay. So tonight is about race, racism, civil rights, and historical perspective. Now, okay. Before I really engage the topic fully, I thought I would just mention a little bit about sources, and I'm not going to go through all these sources, because what's important for us to realize as we're studying this topic tonight, and as we engage the issue of the history of race, racism, and civil rights, we are engaging the history of human rights, really is what we are engaging. The history of African Americans in this country in their struggle to gain the full dignity as human beings from the era of slavery through the era of emancipation and the subsequent era of segregation and the era in our past 25, actually 50 years of civil rights legislation and the ongoing struggle for the rights of human dignity that African Americans really have been struggling with to this day. And so this is a long history, and it is one that as a white person, obviously a white male, I do not understand the sort of personal experience of what it means to be a Black American, to be an African American. I can study the history and I learn the history, but to understand the African American experience in this country, it is not an experience that I have grown up with. And so I think the literature and the evidence is really important for us to engage the African American experience. And I just want to highlight two of them that have been very instrumental over my studies over the past several decades. And I continue to learn, but I want to highlight James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, who in 1963 publishes this work, The Fire Next Time. It's epistolary. It's written as a letter to his nephew, where he highlighted and explained the saga of what it means to grow up Black in America and what it means to deal with the violence that is always on the ready for African Americans in America, as Baldwin understood it in 1963. And in fact, the threat of violence as he understood it, and what it means to grow up as a Black American. And he writes this, and it is a very powerful work. So I'm not going to continue to engage it, but I think if you haven't read Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, you should. It really will give you a window on the African American experience that as people who are, really white, if you would, and not engaging this experience, and really from our white privilege. And I say white privilege, not from a socioeconomic vantage point. We're all in different socioeconomic strata, but by virtue of being white, we are never given the talk. We never have to give our children the talk of what it means to get in that car for the first time, to go in the store, what it means to drive while Black, what it means to, when you go into a store, to be followed by security. That's what white privilege is. We don't experience that if we're white. But if we're Black Americans, African Americans, that is a norm. And Baldwin really illustrates and highlights what that means. Almost 8 years ago. In 2015, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes something called Between the World and Me. It's on your screen, which is taking the form, Baldwin's epistolary form, and this time Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing a letter to his son in 2015. And guess what? He's writing pretty much the same letter that Baldwin wrote in 1963. Things have not improved as they should have. And then there's Ibram Kendi. He wrote, stamped from the beginning, a great history of racist ideas in America, but he also wrote a book on anti-racism and how to be an anti-racist in 2018, I believe it is. And in that book, again, it's a memoir form where he highlights and illustrates what it means to grow up as an African American. It is with empathy that we can read these works to get a sense of that experience, of an African American experience, to help side by side with the scholarship on the history and on the analysis that we need to do on ethnocentrism, cultural chauvinism, and racism in this society. So I just think it's important, and I can send these to Mina and she can share them with you. You can see them on the screen. I don't have time to go through all of them. These are important works. Of course, you know, if you read anything, read Martin Luther King Jr.'s work, Where Do We Go From Here? His last work before really being assassinated. It is an eye-opener in many ways. And again, I don't know if you can screen capture these works, but I'll send them to you. They're very powerful work that can give you an introduction, because source material evidence is important. And having said that, this is a powerful primary media source. It's an old late 80s, early 90s PBS video, Eyes on the Prize. I highly recommend it. It's primary media sources. You will see what was going on in the 50s and 60s, and you will see the civil rights movement come to life. Now, you know, James Baldwin tells us that in an essay, Unnameable Objects, Unspeakable Crimes, in 1965, that history does not refer merely to the past. History is literally present in all that we do. And so what I'm going to try and do tonight is to offer a broad brushstroke to understand the history of race, racism, and civil rights in the United States. It may go in areas that you hadn't expected. I may not make you feel comfortable, but it's not my intention to make you feel comfortable. It's my intention to share what I know so that we can help learn together and understand, without a historical context on the history of racism, that we then can say things like racism has always been with us. We can say things like we have always had racism and it's always been a problem. It will never change. Well, that's patently untrue. Sure, we've always had ethnocentrism. We've always had cultural chauvinism in societies and civilizations dating to the ancient world. We have not always had racism based on the color line. This is a byproduct of the past 500 years. And I will try and illustrate this for us tonight. And it's really important to realize that what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look in, you know, Baldwin tells us history is in everything we do. History informs our present, even when we don't realize it. And so we need to understand that a bit. And it's sort of like having a rear view mirror in the car and side view mirrors. We would never get in our car, and I believe that you can't get a registration in your car if you have a car without rear view and side view mirrors. To go forward in our car, we need to be able to see behind us and on our sides. History is that vehicle for us. How can we go forward in society to understand any of our problems if we don't have the rear view mirrors, if we don't have the side view mirrors? To go forward, we need to look in the past to see where we were, to see how we got here, to try and create resolutions into the future. Where do we begin formally, finally? The Atlantic slave trade. Well, you can say, oh, that's done now. That's 450, that's 500 years ago. Think about this. For 450 years, there was slavery and the slave trade in the West. The Civil War is only ended 150 years ago. So how can these have no influence on our culture today? So I want you to think a little bit about this. We always learned in grade school that, you know, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. What Columbus sailed into was, of course, an era of conquest. We like to call it the age of discovery in many textbooks. It's not an age of discovery. Oh, yes, things were discovered, no question. Columbus accidentally bumps into the Americas. And then other Western Europeans follow suit. And before you know it, the Americas is the new world, but the new world means new empires, right? And for New Spain, new possessions for the English crown, new possessions for the Empire of France, new possessions for the Dutch, etc. It is an age of expansion and conquest, and it is an age of slavery. It is globalization starting off. And what happens with this expansion is the creation of a slave society. And that slave society creates new norms for roughly 400 years. New norms and new business practices around slavery in a culture influenced by slavery. So that when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and I'm just have a couple of charts here, we're not going to go through them. Conservatively, 10 million people were imported, if you would, exported. These are the business terms from West Africa to the Americas. That means 10 plus million, conservatively, the figures go higher, were stolen from their lives, were put into bondage, were enslaved, and transported as slaves to a new world and to a new life of bondage, where they were seen as simply like any other kinds of work animals by their masters. That culture by white European Christians that was created with the business practices of exports and imports that excludes those who were killed in transit. So these figures, 10 to 11 million, excludes West Africans who were killed in transit, who died along the way, and were not recorded for businesses purposes and perhaps for insurance purposes and the like. And this process of leaving West Africa and being stolen from their lives and being brought to the New World in ships like this, with being put, next to each other, you've probably seen this, lie down in chains, packed into these ships. This was the beginning of the dehumanization process of bringing human beings from West Africa as slaves to the New World. And to dehumanize them. They were slaves. They were not us. How else could the white European culture, the white European Christian culture of the New World justify such brutality, but to dehumanize their less than and to provide a sense, and this is what happens, provide a sense of religious justification that we will bring these quote unquote heathens to the New World. And as we're doing so, we will show them the true religion of Christianity, and they will have salvation of their eternal souls. And so, and we will give them a good life, and they will reach their Savior when they die. This justification sounds odd to us, but it seemed to have worked back in that era. And again, we don't have a lot of time for this section, but during this process, the brutality of throwing cargo, right? That's how human beings were seen. Throwing humans off the ship when needed, if food supplies were too low, to salvage the cargo. And so this culture and mentality of business, of cargo, emerges in this slave society and culture where this becomes normal. Branding human beings, and these are some branding irons, shackling them and bringing them to the auctions throughout the Americas, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, Baltimore, all across the Eastern Seaboard. Auctioning human beings became normal part of the culture. You would see not billboards, but bills of sale, advertising of slaves. You would see, cash for men, women, and children. And if they ran away, you'd see these kinds of posters for slaves who were running away. Now, the whole point of this is to give you a sense that there was emerging for several centuries, from the 16th century up until the mid-19th century, a slave society and a culture that justified it. And it wasn't just the southern part of the United States, and that's what we're focusing on today is the United States. New England, the North was involved as well. The ships that went to West Africa were built in New England. Later on, the cotton that came from the South fueled the Industrial Revolution of New England. The notion that somehow the North was separate from the immorality of slavery is a false one. And when we think of the Industrial Revolution, the industrial cities of Brockton and Lowell and so many of them in the Northeast, they were fueled by the products of slavery. And so by the time we get, of course, to the United States emerging with the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we still have to keep in mind that even in the debate toward the US Constitution, as in the 1770s, as the US was emerging out of their War of Independence, there was the issue of slavery that they sidestepped because it was controversial, but it is in the Constitution, so it wasn't fully sidestepped. We think of the Bill of Rights as the rights for human beings, except in Article 1, Section 2, it says, and this is often referred to as the 3/5 clause, it says, any person not free would be counted as 3/5 of a free individual for the purposes of determining congressional representation. So this was all about, of course, increasing the political power of the slaveholding states. And you can see then the influence of slavery and hence the influence of the mentality and the culture supporting slavery, a racist culture in the very founding of the United States. And what we should realize in all of this is that it's not as if there was no group anywhere who was opposed to slavery and opposed to slavery because it was immoral. The abolitionists that emerged in the 18th century into organized movements in their struggle for human rights, this is their symbol. They didn't think slavery was normal. They saw it as a crime against humanity. So it wasn't as if everyone was on board with this. And what we really need to realize moving forward in this is that there is this sense then that slavery in the United States as it emerges was the peculiar institution. It was, the thing that, well, it was an oddity, but we would overcome this oddity. And it wasn't always that bad. There weren't that many slave insurrections, the myth goes. There were many slave insurrections. There were many attempts to rid yourselves of the shackles of slavery. And we even know that Frederick Douglass, in this book by David Blight on Frederick Douglass is outstanding, but Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman are two former slaves who were before the Civil War, who were very, very arduous in their work as part of the abolitionist movement. And we know that when we get to the Civil War is about slavery. So with the Civil War, there is essentially a lot of history, a lot of historical memory, but a lot of myths and a lot that isn't true. I don't know how often across the country today, but very often the Civil War is still taught, and there is still this notion of the Civil War as something that was about states' rights, that it was slavery was a side thing, that the main issue was the southern states and their rights to make decisions with disregard to the national government, the federal government. Sure, it was about states' rights, but it was about slavery. And so when we think of the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, it is important in understanding race and racism and civil rights today. It is important to understand the myths, particularly the myths of the lost cause, as it's called, this notion of the southern states and the Confederacy and of the nobility of their cause in struggling and fighting against the North, and that they're somehow the southern states and the southern soldiers We're fighting to preserve Southern sovereignty against an oppressive federal government. In one of my trips to Savannah many years ago, a taxi cab driver did refer to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. And I was, yes, I'd read about this and then I heard it. And the War of Northern Aggression. And so this notion that it was about states' rights is wrong. It wasn't. It was about slavery, and slavery is the byproduct of a racist culture. It is absolutely a byproduct of a racist culture. We have this notion of the nobility that we hear from different political figures even today, that blue and gray were fighting a noble cause. They both were ardent in their desperate search to, for victory for their side when one side lost, but they were still noble. No, I don't think so. I think that fighting to maintain slavery and fighting to maintain human bondage and fighting to maintain plantations that were essentially open-air concentration camps is not a noble cause. And to think it is a noble cause is problematic. And so what we need to realize is that this yet is the notion that is still current today, that somehow, nobility on both sides. So keep this in mind as we move forward, because this image is a false one. And it means we have to come to terms with the fact that from the founding of the United States, with its constitutional system up to and including the Civil War era, that U.S. culture and U.S. society is embedded with racism, not as a side factor. It is a direct part of the fabric of U.S. society and culture. Racism is, and I'm going to repeat it, racism is part of the very fabric of U.S. culture from its beginnings. And why else was the Civil War fought? And to understand this, don't just take it from me. To understand this, what we need to realize is that, I just noticed I don't have my watch here, is that what we have to understand is that we need to go, like I said, don't take my word for it. The powerful myth here that states' rights was the cause. Let's just go quickly. South Carolina's Declaration of Succession. Let's read what it says. It says, those states, meaning the North, those states assume the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions and have denied the rights of property established in 15 of the states and recognized by the Constitution. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. This is the North, they're saying in their secession, South Carolina's secession in 1861, they're saying that this, the North has taken it upon themselves. They have denounced as what we are doing as sinful. They have permitted open establishment among them of societies like the abolitionists, whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to eloign, an old word, to take away the property of citizens of other states, meaning the Confederate states, as they were coming online. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. This is the South Carolina Declaration of Succession. It's clear. It's about slavery and the rights of property to own slaves. Here's an article from the Constitution of the Confederacy. It says, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. This is the Constitution of the Confederacy. And if you read through all of the articles of succession of the different Confederate states, you will see like-minded, similar worded phrases. And if you continue to read in the Constitution of the Confederacy, you will also see the language that this is about maintaining slavery. So the notion that it's states' rights, sure, it's states' rights, but it's about slavery, and slavery is racism. Now, this was the era too. So if you look to the era, it wasn't just in the United States. If you look to the era after the Civil War, well, before, after, and during, if you look to the 19th century, the Europeans were following suit. This is the era of imperialism and culture. Often referred to, this is Bismarck carving up Africa as a magnificent cake, if you would, and apportioning it out as colonies. So Africa was colonized in the entirety of Africa by the Europeans, with this notion that Africans were subhuman, less than white Europeans. So this was the Western culture imbued with racism that was emerging. Eventually, of course, you will see beyond Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, mainland and maritime will be divided up into British, French, Dutch colonies, all with racist attitudes and hierarchies, with the white Europeans at the top. The US was part of this culture. So culture, racism, normalcy. This is what's going on as we start from 1492, work our way through the 19th century. The culture of the West, particularly as it expanded, was not a sideshow racism. Racism was a direct, if you would, weave. It was all the threads of the weave of the culture of the West, including the US. And if you want to read more about this, of course, go to the sources. In the middle here, we have Arthur de Gobineau, The Inequality of the Human Races. This work done in 1857 creates a hierarchy of races with the white Europeans at the top and grades down, different Europeans having different levels, all the way to the different races. So this is where essentially this notion of scientific racism begins to emerge in the 19th century, in this notion that we can begin to categorize races. This is where the social cultural construction of race, not based in any real science or biology, based on, if you would, a social and ideological construction, emerges. So we have people like Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism emerging in this time, indicating that, yes, there are scientifically different races. And of course, there are some, Darwin told us. Now we can engage this and argue back and forth on what Darwin did tell us. He didn't tell us this. Darwin spoke on a species level, not on an individual level. Here, Herbert Spencer gives us social Darwinism that says, yes, there's the struggle between races, and those that survive are the fittest, and obviously the white Europeans and in the United States, William Graham Sumner writes, what social classes owe each other? Nothing, he says. And of course, we see Rudyard Kipling's work, which we all think of Rudyard Kipling, The Jungle Book, The White Man's Burden is a poem that he writes, of course, but also his work is a literary reflection of racism and culture, of an attitude of the white European, of white US society being dominant. This is where Hitler comes from. When Hitler writes Mein Kampf in the 1920s, Hitlerism and Nazism doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes out of a progression over a period of time in Western history. And so keep this in mind now. And as we focus a bit on the United States here, after the Civil War, it finally ends, correct? We have the era of Reconstruction. During this period, in the 1870s, late 1860s into the 1870s, there is this liberation of the slave society. There is a liberation. There is a renaissance, if you would, of freedmen, men, mind you. Women still don't have the right to vote, black or white in this time. Remember, women don't get the right until the 20th century. It's another story. But here in the 1860s and 70s and 1880s, we see many freedmen, many former slaves becoming office holders, running for election. And I just give you a listing of some of the offices that they held in the different states. And as you can see, over 1,000, 1,500 or so office holders, including federal positions, ambassadors, census marshal, senators, members of the House of Representatives, all the way down. Yet, after 1876-77, when Reconstruction ends, we see the emergence of what we call Jim Crow America. What that is, of course, is racism rearing its head, white Southern society coming back and saying, we're coming back and we are going to put Black Americans in their place. And from 1877 to 1965, you can see that the US becomes a segregated apartheid society. We call it Jim Crow America. You say, well, what happens to all the African Americans who were running for election, who were getting positions? By the 1890s, the African Americans are barred by local ordinance, by state ordinances and state law, just as Georgia recently has changing their the voting rights laws in Georgia and creating identification, and even you can't give people water in line and other sorts of things. Arizona, just as these states today are passing legislation to restrict voting, this is what happens in the Jim Crow segregation that is reemerging in the late 19th century after 1877. And by the 1890s, whether it's local and state ordinances in the southern states barring African Americans from voting and making it very difficult to vote, but that combined with extra legal and legal violence, the threat of being lynched, the threat of violence against you and your family, you see a retreat of African Americans, both legally and extra legally. Added to this, of course, was the legal creation of segregation with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that created the so-called separate but equal doctrine, but it wasn't. It was legal apartheid. It was never separate and equal. And what we see is the violence that begins to unleash against African-American communities across the country. Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where 70 Black, where there's a massacre of over 70 Black citizens and a coup against the Black city government officials in Wilmington. And you can see a burned out building and the armed whites. The Tulsa massacre of 1921, often called the Greenwood Massacre, which we're celebrating the centennial. These were not taught, often are not even taught in the schools, where a huge 35 city block district is essentially leveled by white mobs and aided by officials in Tulsa, including the use of airplanes to bomb what was a thriving middle-class Black African-American community in Tulsa. So this form of violence and lynchings from the KKK, after the Civil War, it was crushed for a while, and then it resurges in the 1890s. And as this emerges, of course, this is a tamer picture of a horrible lynching. But these lynchings where bodies would be mutilated, over 6,000 people that are recorded were lynched in the late 19th into the 20th century. And this horrible phenomenon, this threat of violence, and this emergence of a culture of segregation throughout from the late 19th into the 20th century, where we'll see, whether it's in Memphis, colored only, whether it's in North Carolina and Durham, white ladies only. We cater to white trade only in Lancaster, Ohio. Detroit suburb, 1940. We want white tenants in our white community. This Lewis Mountain picnic ground, Negro area, colored waiting room in a bus station in North Carolina. And these signs, waiting room for coloreds only, colored waiting room. But also the phenomenon of the 1920s beginning, but 1930s, right into the era of the 50s and 60s of sundown towns. So if you were an African American, and during the era of between roughly 1904 until around 1972, there was something called the Great Migration, where roughly 6 million African Americans from the South will migrate to northern cities. Well, during this era, as you're beginning to travel around the country, north and west, you needed the Green Book. You needed there was the Green Book for Negro Americans who would be traveling. That's what it was called. So you would know which towns that you could stop in and which towns never to stop in, and which towns were sundown towns, which is this hidden dimension of American racism. This is a great book on the topic. Even Groton, Mass was a sundown town, where if you were there after sunset and you were an African-American, you could be arrested or worse. Groton has since dealt with this in their, I believe, in their ordinances, but this is a reality of what it meant to be in a racist, segregated society. One where in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan marches in Washington unmasked. And we have people like Ida B. Wells, who a founder of the NAACP, who does a study on lynching and on the lynch law in Georgia, and where she essentially documents the lynching process, the lynching laws that were in effect, and the laws and the violence that took place. I mean, and we know that the NAACP, I'll just tell you, founded in 1909, is in response to persecution and violence against African Americans that was on the uptake. Because what's happening here is that from the 1880s into the early 20th century, we see Tulsa, we see Wilmington, and there are so many other examples. In 1908 in Springfield, Illinois, another huge riot. But there are so many examples, and that the NAACP emerges as a spokesperson, as a vehicle to providing for legal help. And what's happening here, of course, is it's the white America putting Black America in its place during this period of legal segregation. So I mentioned something called the lost cause narrative, and it is a popular cultural view of the Civil War, that the Daughters of the Confederacy, beginning in the 1890s, begin to take on as their cause. And so we'll hear a lot of talk today about Confederate monuments being torn down, and it's erasing our history, canceling our culture. No, it's not. This is where history and white supremacy emerge. Because what happens is that the Daughters of the Confederacy will take it upon themselves and an organization to organize with the reemerging after Reconstruction Southern states, with the Southerners, the white establishment who had been put aside momentarily by the Reconstruction era. And in the 1890s, what we begin to see happening into the early 20th century is the creation of a myth about the lost cause of nobility with the Civil War, and the notion that Civil War monuments were built way back after the Civil War as part of this reality that, you know, both sides were noble. No, it was a dedicated, purposeful effort to rewrite history. And the monuments, when they're constructed as symbols of the South's reemergence and rise. That's why if you look at this one, Robert E. Lee, who came down in 2017, built in 1884. This Stone Mountain, Georgia, a huge Confederate monument, built in the mid-60s. This is Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. And you can see how huge this is. 400 feet above ground, covering 1.5 acres. It's recessed 42 feet into the mountain. This is all intended to show that the whites are in charge. Robert E. Lee, of course, 1917 in Charlottesville, and Silent Sam. Now, the Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, this is where there was the huge rally, and civil rights activists were murdered by the Take Back the Night neo-Nazi movement. But I want to stop and focus a little bit, if time permits. Yes, it does. On this monument of Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina. And I happen to have the speech, the dedication speech by Julian Carr, he was a young Confederate soldier in the Civil War, obviously Confederate soldier. And in 1913, he was invited. He was a successful businessman in North Carolina, and he was invited to give the dedication speech for this monument on the campus of the University of North Carolina. and it's often referred to as the Silent Sam Monument. It's a Confederate soldier. Excuse me. And what he does here, and I want to just read this because this highlights to us what these statues are all about. So here's Julian Carr, and he is, here he is. He says, there are no words. Now, you can imagine this. There's the statue. It's 100 years ago. Well, it's more than 100 years now. And there are a crowd of white folks all around this statue, this bronze, and Julian Carr is giving this speech. 1913. There are no words that I have been able to find in the vocabulary of the English language that fittingly express my feelings in this presence of this occasion. But you know, and I know, that though I might speak with the tongue of men and of angels, neither song nor story could fittingly honor this glorious event. The whole Southland is sanctified by the precious blood of the student Confederate soldier before us. They fought, our brave soldiers from the South, not for conquest, not for coercion, but from a high and holy sense of duty and purpose. This noble gift of the united daughters of the Confederacy touches deeply and tenderly the heart of every man who has the privilege of claiming the University of North Carolina as his alma mater. This monument of bronze honors the valor of all those whom fought and died for the sacred cause of the Confederacy, as well as for the living sons of this grand university. And he goes on. The wives of the South have nurtured their young men and have made the sturdy manhood of the South into the highest product which a Christian race has yet ever attained. This beautiful memorial is unique in one aspect. I have participated at the unveiling of several Confederate monuments and have intimate knowledge of a great many more. But this is the first and only one in which the living survivors have been directly and distinctly mentioned and remembered. And in the distinguished presence, I desire to thank the Daughters of the Confederacy in the name of the living Confederate students for their beautiful and timely thoughtfulness. And then he, for purposes of time, I'll paraphrase, he goes on and he says, actually, this is too powerful, I have to read it. The present generation, 1913, I am persuaded, scarcely takes note of what the Confederate soldier meant to the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race during the 4 years immediately succeeding the war, when the facts are that their courage and steadfastness saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South. When the bottom rail was on top all over the southern states, and today, as a consequence of the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 southern states. Praise God still. It is here in the 13 southern states that the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon race is to be found. Keep this in mind. I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, howbeit rather personal. 100 yards from where I stand today, 1913, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in the shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village, she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. And I performed this pleasing duty in the immediate presence of this garrison, and nothing happened. Again, dear daughters of the Confederacy, I thank you in the name of the 1,800 brave, loyal, patriotic, home-loving young student soldiers who went out from this grand old university to battle for our Southern rights and Southern liberties. 500 who never came back. God bless every one of you and every daughter of the Confederacy in our dear Southland. These are the speeches given time and again in the 1890s into the early 20th century, all the way to the 1960s, of these memorials as they went up. In what? In honor of people who fought a noble battle, war? No. In honor of a social construction of race, in honor of racism, in honor of segregation, in honor of persecution and violence against African Americans. That's what these statues represent. World Wars I and II, segregated military units, right? People came back from these wars to a segregated and violent society. If you were an African American, the threat was there. In 1954-55, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, begins the process of demolishing legal segregation. So this is where it starts. It overturns Plessy. It ends legal segregation, but segregation continues throughout the 50s and 60s. It's here that we see the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many others, white and black alike, who begin to fight and create the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. The work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as he spearheaded this movement, and here at the famous speech in Washington, D.C. in August 1963, where he is delivering his I Have a Dream speech, that a movement with boycotts and against busing, boycotts to force cities and states to begin to the process of fighting back against segregation. And finally, in 1964 and 1965, we have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, with President Johnson signing, and as you can see, inviting the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King to the ceremony. What we see is that the civil rights movement fought against the culture of racism and white supremacy in the United States, clearly. Yet white supremacy and racism remains. It's not over in the fabric of our societies, whether it's the busing debates and controversies in Boston in the 1970s, whether it's similar issues of integrating schools in New York City and in other northern cities, whether it's this, where you see demonstrations today and marches with the Confederate flag flying. At the Charlottesville rally in 2017, with neo-Nazis and white supremacists, the so-called Unite the Right rally. This is where former President Trump said there were good people on both sides. No, there weren't. Charlottesville with the Confederate and the Nazi flag out there. This was a picture I took a couple of years ago. I wasn't driving, my wife was driving. This is on Nesmith Street in Lowell, actually. And this is a red truck with a Confederate flag. I really wanted to say, look, this is the North, we won. But this ideology of racism and this notion of Southern pride and heritage, you want Southern pride and heritage, go to a restaurant, have grits, have shrimp and grits, etc. Have, sweet potato pie, fine. It is not the Confederate flag. It is, what does the Confederate flag represent? This is it, in the insurrection in January, in the halls of Congress, first time the Confederate flag ever showed up there in this rally, in this insurrection. What does it represent? The Confederate flag is the same thing as flying the Nazi flag. We have not come to terms with this history. Are we ignoring the evidence of what the Civil War was? Are we ignoring the evidence of Jim Crow's America and apartheid and the violence against African Americans that's been going on for over 150 plus years? Are we ignoring that when there are demonstrations against taking down monuments and people come out with the Confederate flags, it is the same as the Nazi flag. The Confederate flag represents ideologies of hate. It represents a notion that African Americans as slaves were less than, they were inferior. It represents a notion that they are not us when we are all together. It is as if you were to go to Germany today and say, let's haul up the Nazi flag. It's illegal because the Nazi flag represents the worst form of racism and the worst form of mass murder and violence organized by a state. Well, what does slavery and the culture of persecution and the culture of legal segregation represent in the United States? The worst form of organized racism in the United States. And that's what the Confederate flag represents. It's the same as the Nazi flag. And we can discuss this more in the questions if you prefer, and because I need to get through this, but this is what we as a society don't realize by not having come to terms with the Civil War and its legacy, racism. And so when we look at civil rights, there are many examples children being blown up in churches, buses of freedom riders being blown up, young teenagers being killed by organized white violence. And so when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is successful with Rosa Parks in the Montgomery boycott, bus boycott, you see a picture of the Martin Luther King Jr. at the top, and you see a picture of Rosa Parks in the bottom. This was a staged picture. That's a journalist, because Rosa Parks just wasn't a tired worker who came home one day and decided to sit down. It was part of an organized movement of positive social change, civil rights. And so when we get to the I Have a Dream speech, I want to end with this, but this is important as a way to encapsulate what's going on today. When the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reads this speech, he has a message in 1963. It's 100 years after emancipation, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1863, remember, the Emancipation Proclamation was only for slaves in the states in open rebellion. It wasn't for the border states that had come over to the Union, nor for the North. So just keep that in mind. But in this speech, he says, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and I added people, are created equal. He goes on. Ugh. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, this is 1963, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. And here's the, here. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of this moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. And I underline this for emphasis. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam, meaning in all our protests, in civil rights protests, and will now be content, will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. 1963. And when he writes going forward in 1967, he says, we need to begin to organize inclusive African Americans, white Americans, all Americans to fight the scourge of racism and the lack of full human rights in the United States. So when we come into this past decade, of beginning in 2013, with the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013, and with the record of police brutality in different communities, not all communities, obviously, police officers are on the whole public servants of noble and just courageous valor, if you would, and activity, but not all. And in the past decade, when we have seen Black Lives Matter emerge, the Black Lives Matter never excludes lives. The Black Lives Matter movement has emerged because if we go back to 1963, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said then, this has to stop the violence against African Americans. James Baldwin writes about this violence. It has to stop. This is what it's about. In fact, he goes to live in France. He had enough. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in 2015. Ibram Kendi writes in 2018-19. It's still going on. We have never had to be concerned about driving while white. Driving while Black is real. Institutional racism has a history going back to the Civil War era. It continues. Essentially, after 400 years of slavery, 155 years since the Civil War, 55 years since the civil rights legislation, and still Violence against African Americans and the threat of violence and persecution legally with voting restriction continues. The message in 1963 was it has to stop. It hasn't. And therein lies a problem. The choice is ours. We can either understand the past as it creates the present and value human dignity, recognizing injustices, or suffer from our ignorance in favor of slogans. Thank you. If you have any questions, we can further engage the various topics that I presented to you tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Do you want to stop your screen share?
Oh, yes, forgot.
It's okay. One comment that came through was that our audience was really enjoying your arm movements. It makes it a little bit more lively.
Oh, I didn't even realize I was moving them.
That's okay. So Ken and Sabine want to know, what's your view of Charles Blow's advocating for African Americans to migrate to southern states like Atlanta in order to live more peacefully and also create a political majority?
So, that's an individual choice. I really don't have an opinion on it, to be quite frank with you on that one. I have friends that teach in Atlanta. I've been to Atlanta. I don't have any, a reverse Great Migration. Isabel Wilkerson wrote a great book, actually, called The Warmth of Other Suns. I don't know if you can see it. It's on that list. And it's about the Great Migration of roughly 6 million African Americans from the South to the North. So if you want, if people want to do that, I mean, I don't have an opinion on it.
Is it that would it have a political effect to?
So if you're moving in and with the notion of a mass migration to have a political impact, certainly it will, absolutely. And is that a good thing? It could be, no question. But it's a political question that being really a historian, and I don't shy away from politics, but if people want to do that, I haven't really given it any thought, to be honest.
So next question is, with so many new books published and greater awareness and education about racism, do you feel that white terrorism will finally discontinue or continue as a backlash?
No, I fear it'll continue. I fear very greatly, actually, that until we come to terms with the legacy of racism and the Civil War and segregation in the United States, that you will have groups who firmly believe, firmly believe in white supremacy, even when they don't articulate it as such. And they will take up arms, is my fear. The more that what they see as norms in society, for instance, a lot of schools are named after the Confederate generals and Confederate political figures, and as there are being movements to change their names, and as more and more monuments are coming down and attempts at bringing them down, and as Confederate symbols are being removed from state flags in the South, not all yet, as that happens, people who believe that is Southern heritage. So when I say that the Confederate flag is the Nazi flag, people will disagree. And then you have to essentially have a discussion that says, well, look, what did the Civil War stand for? What was slavery? What supported culturally and socially in terms of beliefs, slavery? How were African Americans treated from the era after the Civil War through into the mid to late 20th century? Do you drive while white, and have you had to give a talk to your children about when they're adults as white children, because the police may pull them over just for being white? You don't have none of that, if you would. And that's a discussion and an engagement we need to have across the country. Historical education is lacking in this regard. If you went to Germany, and you saw someone building a statue to Hitler because he was a great hero, or Goering or Goebbels or Eichmann, because they were great heroes. So, all right, they had, there's some horrible stuff, but look, they created a great railroad system. Look, they did put Germany back to work again in the 1930s before the war. Are you kidding me? So you're not gonna put them up. They're murderers. They represent a horrible system, right? A racist system. Well, what did Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and the rest represent? Apple pie or fried chicken? No, they represented a horrible culture of racism and slavery that they wanted and they fought to continue. Those are our Southern heroes? No, those are rebels. They rebelled, and they rebelled to maintain the most horrible of societies, a slave society, which was glorified with things like Barbara Mitchell's Gone with the Wind and other literary and other films. We didn't even get into that. We didn't have time. So no, that flag, the Confederate flag, is the same as flying the Nazi flag. And so are putting up the Confederate leaders as somehow noble people. They not at all. Not at all.
Thank you.
Did I answer your question?
I think you did. So I was wondering, so back after the Civil War was fought and finished, and Lincoln got assassinated and all that, and then the Southerners turned to more of an economic reason to keep slavery, the 3/4-5 rule and all of that. What could people have done differently then? I'm sure that there were people that were fought against this. What could people have done differently back then that would have had a greater effect?
Well, the abolitionist movement, people were doing a lot. The abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad, which is, indicative of a huge movement to help slaves escape and get them into the North, and then sometimes into Canada as well. Even in Lowell, if you would, there are houses that are now long gone, weren't preserved, that were a part of the Underground Railroad. I remember going to Gettysburg, and in one of the inns, showing the cupboards, they had these secret compartments where they would hide slaves fleeing the South. So there were many, many, many people working very hard to help slaves flee the South. Before the Civil War, there were many attempts, frankly, with the different compromises, to try and begin to engage the issue of slavery. The Southern states were intransigent, and they would not hear of it, hence the Civil War, when Lincoln was elected. So what could have been done, honestly, I don't think anything could have been done other than what was. And unless the Southern states would have been willing to end slavery, there was nothing else to be done. It came to the Civil War. That's how I see it. And I think that's your question.
Well, I was thinking more after the Civil War, during Reconstruction,
Sure.
And you had mentioned that there was a time when politically there were a lot of Black leaders,
yeah.
and then that went away. So it just seems like this cycle of having some power amongst the Black community and then losing it, and then coming back.
This is what makes the Black Lives Matter movement so misunderstood, frankly, by many in society. It is Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., 1963, saying, either there's going to be an autumn of freedom or there'll be a reckoning. Well, there's a reckoning. And what happens is, after the Civil War, yes, while federal troops were garrisoned throughout the Southern states, and while the Southern states were not yet readmitted into the Union, there was a process to go through. There could have been, you say, why didn't that continue? Because of a political deal in 1876-77, the Democrat and Republican parties made a deal politically to remove federal troops in 1876-77 if the candidate for the federal election would be a Republican. And we don't have time to get into all of that. And that deal ended Reconstruction. And once federal troops left the South, and again, if we go into some of the southern states, the violence against African Americans that federal troops put down in the 1860s and 70s. The Ku Klux Klan first emerges in the late 1860s, but by the early 70s is crushed by federal troops, is crushed by federal investigations. Had federal troops remained longer, I mean, this is where we're no longer historical, and had the Republican Party, because they were the party of Lincoln, and they were the party of Reconstruction, and had they continued Reconstruction and continued the imposition of federal troops and the imposition of legality, where the new Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th amendments, the guaranteed freedom, guaranteed due process, guaranteed citizenship for the new freedmen of former slaves. If federal troops remain and if Reconstruction continued, another generation, and I know that sounds almost like wow, but had it continued another 10, 15, I would say 20 years, you might have seen differences. You might have seen changes, and you might have had a longer period of time before the Republican Party became the party of big business in the late 19th century as the Gilded Age emerged. They essentially stopped being the party of Reconstruction. And so I think that's what needed to happen, but it didn't. And that's when we see the Jim Crow America reemerge, and we see the emergence of the white resurgence until finally 1896, it's all legalized. And by the way, when the Supreme Court votes on Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, it establishes the separate but equal doctrine legally that establishes segregation, apartheid. Only one justice dissented. The rest of the court went along with it. And that one justice, Justice Harlan, did say at that time, the Constitution should be colorblind, but he was alone. So I think that a lot had to change to allow this sort of, I call it a renaissance, but this liberation of the former slaves to continue developing within the full dignity of their human rights and political rights guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But I believe that African Americans were abandoned by both the Republican and Democratic parties. Well, the Democratic Party in that time was not in favor of Reconstruction at all. And that's a whole other lecture and a whole other discussion. But I believe they were abandoned, and for purposes of politics and economics between the Republicans and Democrats back in 1876, 77. And then you saw the litany of oppression and persecution that happens as a result. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. We just have time for one more question.
Sure. I'm ready.
What is your view of the success of Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King in generating change of hearts and minds?
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
What is your view of the success of Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King in generating change of hearts and minds?
So, that's a great question. I would say that sometimes we misunderstand that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, initially, while they may have had different strategies and tactics, I mean, by the end of their lives, it was pretty unified. Their message was about inclusivity and about the full spectrum of social and economic, as well as civil rights, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans in terms of all at the lower end of the socioeconomic strata. I mean, when Martin Luther King goes to Memphis, I'm having a brain freeze, but he's going to support the sanitation worker strike. He is beginning to increasingly engage the economic issues that Malcolm X is engaging. And that's where he was assassinated. And as Malcolm X became more and more of a threat to established interest within the movement in his neck of the woods, he was also, of course, assassinated. But they were, we sometimes misunderstand, these were very young men in their 30s. And they were still developing and growing and engaging. And in many ways, they were beginning to coalesce around a message. Yes, maybe they have a different tactic for capturing hearts and minds, but it really was about legally changing laws to provide the full breadth of human rights, including laws that guaranteed labor rights. They were both coming into that. And I think, obviously, in many ways, my opinion is that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was much more successful. But Malcolm X was also increasingly gaining lots of success. So I think they were cut short too soon. And I think you would have seen them increasingly. Now, again, how do I know? I'm not a prophet. And unfortunately, they were assassinated. But I think you would have seen a coalescing also with other political elements, like, frankly, Senator Robert Kennedy and others. You would have seen, I think, more coalescing around the issue of human rights, civil rights, and inclusivity, particularly within the economic dimensions, and how it affects us all. And I think the Vietnam War was really exposing that in a big, big way. So that's my take on it.
Wow, thank you. That was amazing, David. Thank you so much for all of your insight. And I feel like I've learned like my entire high school curriculum in like 1 hour.
I thank you. I mean, I don't know if there are any more questions. I know it's getting late, but I think that for me, there's always a clear message. And in this, I really try, like I said, I paint this broad brushstroke. We're moving quickly. We often don't realize that, when the Black Lives Matter, and I just have to say this again, if you don't mind, that the Black Lives Matter movement and the massive demonstrations and protests, sure, things get out of hand sometimes, no question. There are riots, and there's all kinds of issues. Yet, the responses that we often get is, oh, what's going on here? This is a 200-year in the making persecution, if you would. Mm. And it's going on. And I saw a photo recently of some of the insurrectionists, and there's no other way to call them that, on January 6th at the Capitol, in the faces of police officers in riot gear with the masks and everything, yelling and screaming. And they were just standing there being, patient. And then I saw the African-American state legislator in Georgia, as the Georgian governor and other members of the Georgian state legislature signing a new voter restriction law into place in front of a painting of a former plantation where there were slaves back in the day. And yet I see this Black African-American state legislator being handcuffed and arrested and charged with the felony for knocking on the governor's door, protesting this law, when we see the insurrectionists with their Confederate and neo-Nazi and Nazi flags not immediately getting the same treatment. Mm-hmm. That indicates the racial divide in a very powerful way. And so I think the message is, understand the history. And if we understand the history and know the history, not the lost cause narrative of mythology that the Daughters of the Confederacy and their legacy would have us believe, but the history based in evidence. And if you want, I can share those sources and you can send them out to the group as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that I'll send out your book recommendations to everybody in the recap, because somebody did ask. But yeah, this is powerful and informative, and I think like we all need to really just absorb some of the information that you've shared with us, and try to find a way to feel hopeful, given that this is like the downturn of this cycle, right?
So, a philosopher once said, "It is for those without hope that hope exists." I think it was Walter Benjamin in the 1920s. And if I remember correctly, So there's always hope. We need to be hopeful, but I think the fact that we're engaging and talking and we're continuing to engage and talk, I have hope. I have to have hope. You know, I'm retired from full-time teaching, and but my hope has always been with the generation coming up, and I'm hopeful because of that generation. I think our generation, I think that we needed to do much more. You know, the fact that history, and I like to say real history, is not required, and that the history of understanding races, and that we don't even understand the Confederate flag as Nazi flag, that we don't get that. And that I think that's a huge problem, that we can have trucks with the Confederate flag driving through our cities and people not understanding that that's just like having, of course, some of them would have the Nazi flag if they could. That's another problem.
Right.
All right, entirely. But I think that history is, we in this country are too ahistorical, and we don't realize how specialized the field and how specialized the field it is and needs to be taught in the middle and in the high schools. We can't continue to teach Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in the Age of Discovery. That's the beginning point, right?
Mm-hmm. Right,
So,
exactly.
So I'm hopeful the change will emerge. I'm just not hopeful it's coming quickly.
All right, well, we have to definitely wrap our minds around that one. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here. I hope you've learned a lot. And like I said, I will send out that information from David in my recap. So have a wonderful night. Thank you, David. I really appreciate this.
I thank you very much for having me. And if anyone has any questions, they want to email you, send them along.
I will. Thank you so much.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.